So the title, I think in the process of suggesting this title, it got simplified in the advert for this talk. So it's a little bit more, slightly more wordy than the one suggested in the email that was circulated. So it's beyond the cross-cultural thinking ethnographically about mental health. So yeah, my background, I'm not really going to talk about my ethnographic research as such, but I can go into that a bit more in our discussion round. But yeah, just to say, I did my PhD on NHS talking therapies and on the implementation of evidence-based psychological therapies in the NHS and some of what I call the scientific persuasions that were taking shape around evidence-based therapy more broadly. So I've been studying various aspects of mental health care in the UK for over 12, 13 years now, I think, with a focus particularly on psychotherapeutic care. And in my research, I came across, as we do in mental health research, the language of culture and the cross-cultural, which is still very prevalent in today's mental health research. So it's a bit of a provocation, this talk, but more so I want to just open up a conversation and try to kind of collaboratively and in a kind of multidisciplinary way or interdisciplinary way reflect on what it might actually mean to carry out cross-cultural research in anthropology specifically, but also more broadly in mental health research. And I want to question some of the enthusiasms here. So yeah, I probably won't be able to disguise then a point that I think is important to make, and that is that I find much of the language of culture and the cross-cultural in mental health research rather unnecessary and outdated. And that's partly because I was educated in a style of social anthropology that has long dispensed with the concept of culture, at least analytically. Now, that should not be taken to suggest that we shouldn't pay close attention to comparison and context and indeed difference. And that's a point I'll come back to later on. So I want to start out by just giving a bit of background. So in order to situate anthropological studies of mental health and this concern with culture, I want to take us back to, now that we're in Cambridge, to the 1898 Cambridge Torres Straits expedition, which was carried out in collaboration between anthropology and psychology, and is set out to study what was then conceived as primitive and savage minds. And it was partly done in response to what we would now call Victorian scientific racism. Ideas about primitive minds being somehow down the ladder of evolutionary development. And this expedition tried to look at human interiority through new techniques of introspection. So it was partly inspired by theories that came out in the late 19th century by the German psychologist William Wundt and his investigations into what became the generalized mind or the human mind. So obviously we're in a time in which all sorts of scientific objects are being standardized and stabilized in the sciences more broadly. And William Wundt and others suggested that there were technologies and theories of introspection that the scientists, psychologists could be trained in that would allow them to observe the mind as it is. So some of the kind of analogies here is obviously the biologist or the natural scientist who would observe nature as it is. And it's also obviously a period where we have technologies that have informed what Darsten and Gallison have called a mechanical objectivity, right? So the scientist had to stand back and drain himself from subjectivity and from emotions and everything else that was deemed to get in the way. And similarly, these technologies of introspection would allow the psychologist to observe objectively the human mind, as it were. And the expedition here used some, were inspired by some of these inquiries and took it to these so-called primitive societies. And one of their concerns was actually to disprove this evolutionary idea about civilized and primitive minds. So they were concerned about, so one of the dominant ideas was that primitive minds or mentalities were seen to not perform well in relation to or in comparison with civilized Western minds, because more energy was spent on people's physicality. So they would physically outperform the civilized Westerners, but cognitively not perform very well. So they were challenging this notion. And at the same time, in the 1920s, so a bit later, we have in anthropology quite a few prominent scholars, including the Polish-British social anthropologist Bronisław Malinowski, who is drawing on psychoanalytic theory in order to engage or situate or make sense of that ethnographic data. So this was quite common, and it was a very mutual engagement between psychoanalysis and anthropology at the time, and clinical psychology more broadly. And Malinowski famously debunked Freud's notion of the Oedipal complex as a kind of universal, as a universal psychological development in his work with tropy and kin relations in his book Sex and Repression in Savage Society. So I just want to give a sense of that there were engagements. There's a long-standing history between anthropology and the science disciplines, and it's a history that's marked by a lot of rivalry, also collaboration, as in this example, but also a lot of mutual disregard for one another. So moving across the pond, American anthropology in the first half of the 20th century offered a different engagement with psychological ideas and theories, and specifically what became known as the culture and personality school that grew out of the US, and that was particularly pioneered by students of Franz Boas, a very famous American cultural anthropologist, and his students Margaret Mead, Ruth Benedict, and Edward Sapir in the 1920s and especially 1930s. And they were influenced by their own critical rereading of Freudian psychoanalysis. And in that rereading, we have a notion of culture here where they were seeking a kind of description of mental health and especially psychopathology through ethnographic research on individual personality. So the notion here, or the category of culture, was very much informed by both psychoanalysis and linguistics, in which, speech, for instance, how speech is patterned by linguistic structure, the same way they were thinking about the personality of cultures, as they called it. So it was to really unpack the different cultural patterns. And these cultural patterns of, say, childhood experience were seen to be the cause of adult personality characteristics. So very much in this kind of psychoanalytic developmental tradition that would then in turn give rise to culture-specific patterns of mental illness. So you can see, I want to just map out here different engagements and different studies with culture. We can come back to them with more detail. There is some necessary simplification in all of this, but we can complicate it later on. But the psyche here is a culturally patterned phenomenon. Now, kind of taking on our fast-forward boots to the 21st century. This is just, again, an example, and I want to draw on the work of Tanja Luhrmann and her colleagues. So Tanja Luhrmann is a very renowned social anthropologist who has been studying various aspects of psychiatry, including diagnosis and treatment. And in one of her books here, her edited volume, she's looking at schizophrenia and case studies of schizophrenia across cultures. More recently, she is engaged in the Mind and Spirit project, which is also a collaborative psychological and anthropological project on the experience of invisible others. So for Tanya Lerman and others, the way in which they engage with culture in relation to mental health research is very much an idea of cultures as this kind of what I call as a filter, as a filtering through that shapes people's experiences and perceptions of their own minds, and in turn, therefore, also their experience of their mental ill health, right? So you have to imagine we are not anymore in this kind of strictly structural linguistic idea of culture as patterns and structure of people's experiences, but rather but rather culture, our cultural context invites us to engage with our own human interiority, with our own mental events in particular ways. So here, particular cultural understandings of the mind will shape the ways that people attend to and interpret their mental events. So you can see here why in relation to schizophrenia that's very, very important. And some of the striking examples that in India, for example, people with schizophrenia in some parts of India, people with experienced schizophrenic hallucinations as their family members, their mother telling them to do the dishes, for example, whereas in a US context, it'll be demonic cries. And Satan himself speaking through. Right, so they're very different experiences of schizophrenia, and they have done a very thorough cross-cultural examination of this. One important point I think to highlight here is that they're talking about culture also in this cultural model of mind as inviting or offering people different distinctions. So you can think about self-other relations are drawn differently. So you can think about some of the work with Marilyn Strathern and ideas of the individual or the dividual, to what extent people are relational beings, and to what extent we can locate mental ill health firmly in this interesting organ called the brain, and the brain, affects the mind, and the mind affects a human subjectivity, and so on, right? So there are different distinctions being made here. One important one that Tanya Lerman has drawn out is that between an interior and an exterior world, right? So your own human or mental interiority in relation to the world around you. So for many people in non-Western societies, that is not a clear-cut, that is not the same, at least, clear-cut boundary that a lot of European or American societies have, right? So she's talking, for example, about bounded minds and porous minds, and the porosity of the mind can allow you to have different kinds of experiences. This is also taken up into her research on evangelical Christianity, on the experience of magic, and other phenomena, where you can see that you can actually train yourself in these contexts to have a different experience, a different perception of your mind. So culture here is really about the plasticity of perception and experience. It both offers a way in which we can, it offers ways in which we can train a different kind of perception and experience of mental health, but it also provides the parameters or the framework within which certain experiences are being interpreted and qualified. We can come back to some more examples. So I just want to, this is what I call the layer cake model of mental health. It's just a way to, again, open up a way of thinking about culture as a useful framework for mental health research or not, or to question, indeed, the status of that framework. So one very influential way of thinking about culture is in relation to a kind of layer cake epistemology, if you will, of mental health, in which the world is stacked in layers, right? So if you do mental health research, you will know that we have already had a division of the sciences into biology and psychology and the social science and the cultural studies. And still to this day, a lot of mental health research is both verifying and replicating this model again and again and again, in which we have some kind of ontological bedrock would be the biological variables or factors, whether it's biomarker or whatever, language you want to use, but you have a kind of the bedrock of nature, of biology, and then on top of that you have psychology, and then on top of that you have some cultural fluff or the social experience. And this is very much still a very predominant model in mental health research, and indeed it's a very predominant model of how we organize institutions around us, and indeed how the sciences are organized, right? I mean, in Cambridge we have the distinction between the arts. You get a bachelor in the arts or the bachelor in science, right? So these are distinctions and bifurcations of the human that came out of in the 18th and 19th century, and we've very much inherited this layer cake model. So the deeper down the layers, the more real mental health is felt to be, or could be said to be, right? So you will know that as well from our own context in the UK, where there's a lot of debates and also a lot of controversial debates or contested debates about everything from autism to ADHD and depression and anxiety. Where is it located? Is an effect of biochemical imbalanced and biochemically imbalanced neurology, if we're talking about depression, for instance. So where are we locating mental ill health is ethnographically interesting. And an effect of this model is that, of course, if we have culture on top floating around with the clouds, is that neurobiology, which is now neuropsychology or psychiatry, can then be tended to be seen as some kind of culture-free domain of reality, in which the cross-cultural, the cultural framework or perspective is to be seen to complement, to bring in context, to bring in meaning. We can talk more about that. I think it's still an interesting distinction, and I think it throws up a lot of problems still in mental health research. One of the problems is, of course, the biopsychosocial model, which has been incredibly influential in mental health research and related fields. And that was a model that was suggested by the American psychiatrist George Engels in the late 1970s, and it has been revised and reformulated since then. But what's really interesting about this model is that it's both trying to bring together different disciplines, right? So biology, psychology, social science, and so on, alongside the associated realities, body, mind, society, or culture. So rather than treating these as separate phenomena, this model claims to furthermore holistic and scientifically rigorous understanding of humans as biopsychosocial beings. So in the context of mental health, that might mean an understanding that encourages a perspective on treatment in which it is no longer sufficient for interventions to consider only biological or psychological factors or treatment factors. Instead, treatment must include the social or the cultural in the sense of environment, context, and culture. So according to this model, mental health is not only a case of a biological body, for example, a case of brain chemistry in the context of depression, existing anterior to its psyche, social relations or environment, but of a whole body, mind subject that is biologically, psychologically, and socially constituted in a particular cultural world. So that's a very powerful framework, and it's quite novel in many ways. However, the anthropologists might wonder at the separations and the connections here that are being affected, and especially the hyphens. And we might ask, for example, if this tripartite differentiation, indeed the hyphenations put forward in the biopsychosocial, are still suggestive of a problem in mental health research rather than offering a novel reconciliation between these different, perceivedly different realities. So another example of a model of culture is, and I've touched on that before, is understanding culture as contextuality or context and meaning. So many of you will probably be aware of Arthur Kleinman's work on explanatory models and patient experience, and him and his colleagues in the 1970s published this very influential article in which they suggested a distinction being made in biomedicine between disease and illness, where disease is the medical reality and illness is the patient experience. And it was a way in which to make anthropological insights, and especially culturally sensitive insights, available and applicable in psychiatric and medical context. So a lot of their work, and a lot of the work that has inspired mental health research in anthropology, has often been in this kind of interdisciplinary borderland between anthropology, psychoanalysis, and psychiatry, often with the aims of improving psychiatric treatment and diagnosis and so on, rather than, for example, dismantling psychiatric assumptions. Another one, another scholar I should probably mention is Roland Littlewood, who sadly died last year. He's a very famous British medical anthropologist who also became a psychiatrist and has published on mental health as well. And he has presented this distinction that can also be quite helpful between personalistic and naturalistic understandings of mental ill health, in which in the natural sciences or in experimental psychology, there is a tendency to think about mental ill health as a naturalistic causality. So in these kind of as a kind of causal modality in which psychiatric etiology is located in, say, neuronal connectivities or biochemical imbalances and so on, and therefore also can be treated with drugs. As opposed to a personalistic understanding of mental ill health, where it is located in the biographical trajectory of the individual, the patient, right? So it's a whole social, it's a more holistic account, and it's what we find in psychotherapeutic care, where we have a more social biography, a relational biography, and ill health or psychiatric disorders might be located in this relational trajectory. And that, we know that was criticized extensively in a kind of biomedically orientated psychiatry, especially in the US, where psychoanalysis, for instance, or psychotherapeutic or psychodynamic therapy was seen to have held patients accountable for their experience of mental ill health, and it was finally no longer the parents' fault or your past relationships, but rather, if depressed, you are suffering from a neurological disorder. So it was also a way of destigmatizing mental ill health. So there are a lot of interesting shifts going on here that took shape really in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. One of the problems with this framework, though, is that it's still, with Kleinman's framework of a disease-illness distinction or division, was that it still tended to leave intact a common dichotomy in mental health research and in the sciences more broadly, in which doctors came with scientific knowledge and patients presented with culturally determined beliefs, right? So we are still in this epistemology where knowledge is posited against beliefs, and often we were talking about the patient experience in the singular and not paying attention to patient experiences. That's something we can come back to, but I think it's an important point to mention, and it's been very influential in cross-cultural research. So we're kind of left with an attention to cultural difference and to different cultures, in which, when we are talking about the cross-cultural perspectives, we are often talking about it as a mode of contextualizing the objects of study. So it's a very much still a mode of contextualization, and one that is still deemed important in a field of biological determinism. So I'm not trying to ignore or eschew the salience of culture or the cross-cultural perspective or context here, but I am trying to kind of question how analytically productive it is to talk about culture in quite these terms. I should probably also mention, there's another point that we can come back to, and that is also that culture, of course, has also been part of a mode of anthropological critique. So, for example, pointing to, or social science critique, pointing to the culture of the clinic or professional culture and being able to recontextualize patients and professionals and so on, is still a very common way of talking about culture in this sense. Just conscious of time. So, should we go or move beyond culture? That's the question. So, I want to suggest that culture is still important in the sense that we have to pay attention to context, comparison, and difference. However, talking about the cross-cultural, and I might just actually take a step back. So the cross-cultural here is what, for example, anthropologist Mikkel Kenni has called lateral comparison, right? So you are comparing in this kind of comparability epistemology, you are comparing light with light, right? So you're taking a case of depression, say, or schizophrenia, and then you're comparing it across different contexts. So it's a lateral comparison, right? It's the same object. You're not necessarily questioning the content of the object because you're comparing the form across different contexts, right? A very simplified version, but that's a lateral comparison as opposed to a frontal comparison that would be an us-them, a vertical comparison. So yeah, I just want to highlight that. It's just one mode of comparative investigation. It's not the only way of doing anthropological comparison. But yes, so an ethnographic approach here would pay attention to how people are defining and enacting and understanding mental health, right? So we're looking at mental health as very much a category in action. And that's very interesting because, of course, we're living in a time in which everyone, at least in many parts of the world, are deemed to have mental health, right? Everyone has it, and it's become a human right through the World Health Organization. And as Alexandrova, I think, discussed in her first presentation here, she discussed different definitions of mental health, from a minimalist one to a very ambitious or complex one that we find in WHO. So if we are looking at mental health, we're not taking it for granted as a pre-given reality that comes anterior to its articulations or relationalities, but we are looking at it as an interesting category, as an interesting language that assumes and requires a specific vision of human interiority. And I'm saying interiority here, or internality rather than subjectivity, because that already comes with its contradistinction, which is objectivity, and there have been many, as we know, many theories of subjectivity. So I just want to kind of open up more conceptually that we have to just, human interiority might not end at the bounded body, right? Or at the body bounded by the skin, but just that we have different models, different notions of what it means to have a sense of self, have an interior experience, which might indeed extend into an environing world or into relationships beyond yourself. So in this approach as well, we are treating the language of culture as an ethnographically interesting phenomenon, or as an ethnographically interesting language. So it re-enters here as part of the ethnography, that is, as part of the theories that the people that we work with or study have of themselves and the worlds in which they live. So, it could, for example, be how people construct and experience contextually an apparent commonality, for example, we have with nation states through education systems and so on. People might very much live that affective, corporeal reality and align it with a notion of culture. So in this, it's important to know that when culture has featured as a concept in kind of our analytical toolbox, it has often tended to imply beliefs, ideas, the kind of social construction of something else, so back to the layer cake model, or human behaviors from the neck up, so to speak. And it is also easily reified as if cultures meet or bump into each other, or it is understood as some kind of generative template, or indeed a kind of filtering, which is, I think, evocative in some of Tanya Luhrmann's work. Of course, there are different ways in which to engage with the culture. You know, there have been an emergence of various affect and embodiment theories over the past 20, 30 years, which offer a different vantage point to bring in difference, context, and comparison, and to pay attention to people's own experiential realities, and of being in an environing world that constitute different kinds of body-mind selves, or mind-body selves. And we can also, I mean, Margaret Lock has also talked about local biologies, and obviously the field of epigenetics has been incredibly influential here in really radically rethink some of these layer cake models or other outdated epistemologies. So one point I just want to make before I will finish is that the cross-cultural also in a way overshadows another point, that if we want to actually keep the language of culture still in our analytical toolkits, and that is of course intracultural diversity, right? So you can think about our own case again in the UK, and how politicians or clinicians, how public discourses define, say, anxiety and depression. And we have already within a so-called culture of the UK, or in British culture, different models of the mind in circulation, and they might be in conflict with one another. They might confirm different ideas of selfhood. And I think it's an important point, and it's something that the cross-cultural perspective doesn't always pay attention to, because we are still in this world in which cultures are taken for granted as somehow bounded or have their own, if not essence, then at least they often come with a notion of a people, other in kind of ethnological terms, and that people has its own language, its own nation state, at least in some of the Euro-American contexts and so on, right? So this is very, very much still a kind of Herdian and 19th century idea of culture, in which we get a fully formed package. We get a people with a language and customs and their own experiences and perceptions of the world in which they live in, and then mental ill health or pathologies just travel through culture, as it were. Okay, I think I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much for listening.